The hospital discharge papers felt light in my hands, but the weight of returning to real life pressed heavily on my shoulders. 3 weeks after a stroke that doctors called moderate but concerning, I was finally going home. At 67, I had stared mortality in the face and emerged grateful for a second chance. "Mrs. Wilson, do you have someone picking you up?" Nurse Chen asked, her kind eyes assessing my stability as I rose from the wheelchair. "Hospital policy for all discharges, regardless of how well you could walk." "My son should be here any minute," I replied, checking my phone again. No messages from Eric, which wasn't entirely surprising. Punctuality had never been his strong suit, something I'd made excuses for since he was late to kindergarten 3 decades ago. "I can wait with you in the lobby," she offered, clearly reluctant to leave me alone. "That's not necessary. I'm sure he's just stuck in traffic." The familiar words flowed automatically, the same explanation I'd given to teachers, employers, and even Eric's ex-girlfriends over years of missed appointments and broken commitments. As Nurse Chen reluctantly left, I settled into a lobby chair, my small suitcase beside me. After 20 minutes, I called Eric's cell phone for the 3rd time, straight to voicemail. "Eric, honey, I'm waiting at the hospital entrance. Please call me when you get this." A familiar worry gnawed at my stomach, the same anxiety that had shadowed me through Eric's turbulent adolescence, his dropped college courses, his series of almost career breakthroughs, and his ongoing financial temporary setbacks. At 42, my younger son still lived like a man expecting life to begin tomorrow, once his luck finally turned. After an hour, I gave up waiting and called a taxi. The driver, a grandfatherly man with salt and pepper hair, helped me with my suitcase and asked about my hospital stay. "Stroke," I explained simply. "But I'm one of the lucky ones. No permanent damage." "You have family at home?" he asked kindly. "A son," I said, the automatic pride in my voice a reflex developed over years of defending Eric to others. "He must have gotten tied up with something important." The driver nodded without comment, his eyes in the rearview mirror, holding a wisdom that suggested he recognized a mother's familiar excuse-making. As we approached my modest ranch-style home in the suburbs of Phoenix, a sense of unease grew stronger. The front yard, which Eric had promised to maintain during my hospital stay, was visibly neglected. Newspapers piled up on the driveway despite my subscription being on vacation hold, and my carefully tended rose bushes drooped in the Arizona heat, clearly unwatered for days. "Would you like me to wait until you get inside safely?" the driver offered, clearly concerned. "That's very kind, but I'll be fine," I assured him, tipping generously from the emergency cash I kept in my wallet. The house key was where it always was, under the ceramic turtle in the garden, despite my having given Eric his own key years ago. Inside, the disarray made my heart sink. Dishes piled in the sink, takeout containers on the coffee table, and the distinct smell of neglect hanging in the air. This wasn't just a day or two of bachelor living. This was prolonged absence. I moved slowly through the house, cataloging the evidence of Eric's disregard for his promises to "take care of everything, Mom. Don't worry." The plants were dying. Mail overflowed from the basket, and my bedroom, which should have been untouched, showed signs of having been thoroughly searched. My jewelry box sat open on the dresser, its contents disturbed. With trembling hands, I reached for the small velvet pouch where I kept my wedding ring, the one piece I didn't wear in the hospital because my fingers had been swollen. The pouch was empty. My husband Robert's voice seemed to whisper in my memory. "Margaret, that ring isn't just gold and diamonds. It's 3 generations of Wilson women. My grandmother survived the Depression without selling it. Promise me you'll pass it down." Cold realization washed over me as I moved to my home office. The bottom drawer of my desk, where I kept my financial documents, had been forced open, the lock broken. The folder containing my bank statements and checkbook was missing. So was the emergency cash box that held $2,000. With growing dread, I found my laptop and logged into my bank account, something Eric had helped me set up years ago, insisting I give him the password. "Just in case you need help with online banking, Mom." The screen loaded, revealing numbers that couldn't possibly be correct. My checking account, $42.18. My savings account, $236.75. My certificate of deposit, closed, penalty for early withdrawal applied. Just 3 weeks ago, Before the stroke, my accounts had held over $150,000, my life savings, carefully built over 40 years of teaching high school English, supplemented by Robert's life insurance, and my modest inheritance from my parents. Money intended for my retirement security and, eventually, to be divided between my sons. As the truth dawned with horrifying clarity, my phone rang. The screen showed Eric calling, his smiling face, a photo taken on his last birthday when I'd given him yet another loan to get through a temporary rough patch, mocking me with its innocence. I almost didn't answer. For the first time in 42 years, I didn't want to hear my son's voice or his explanations. But decades of maternal response couldn't be overcome in an instant. "Hello, Eric. Mom, you're home." His voice carried the forced enthusiasm I'd learned to recognize over years of post-disaster conversations. "Sorry about not picking you up. Something came up. A job interview, actually. Really promising position. Could change everything." The familiar script, crisis, followed by excuse, followed by promise of imminent turnaround, suddenly sounded hollow in a way it never had before. Perhaps the stroke had altered something in my brain after all, removing whatever filter had allowed me to believe the best about my son, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. "Where's my money, Eric?" I asked quietly. The silence on the other end spoke volumes. "Mom, I can explain." Eric's voice took on the cajoling tone I knew too well, the same one he'd used when caught skipping school at 12, stealing his father's credit card at 16, and borrowing my car to drive to California at 20. "It's not what you think. What I think," I said with a calm that surprised me, "is that you emptied my life savings while I was in the hospital recovering from a stroke. What I think is that you pawned my wedding ring, your grandmother's ring. Am I mistaken about any of that?" Another pause, then a tactical shift. "I was going to tell you about that. I've got a sure thing, Mom. A system that can't fail. I just needed capital to make it work. Another week, maybe 2, and I'll double your money. Triple it even." The familiar words echoed across years of similar promises. The real estate scheme that would revolutionize the market. The startup that needed just a little seed money. The guaranteed investment opportunity with his friend's cousin's business partner. "Where are you, Eric?" I asked, suddenly exhausted. "Vegas," he admitted. "But it's not what you think. This is business, not pleasure. I've made some incredible connections. High rollers who've taken me under their wing. One guy runs a hedge fund." "Vegas," I repeated, the single word cutting through his elaborate narrative. "You took my life savings to gamble in Las Vegas while I was in a hospital bed." "Not gamble, Mom. Invest. There's a difference." The injured innocence in his voice was as familiar as my own reflection. "Look, I know it seems bad, but I've got things under control. I just need a little more time for everything to—" "Where is my wedding ring?" I interrupted, surprising both of us with my directness. A longer silence this time. "Temporarily in safekeeping with a collateral management specialist." "You mean a pawn shop." My voice sounded strange to my own ears. Sharper, clearer, stripped of the gentle understanding that had characterized my interactions with Eric for decades. "A high-end establishment," he corrected quickly. "Look, I've got the ticket right here. We can get it back as soon as—" "As soon as what, Eric? As soon as you win back the $150,000 you took from me? As soon as your system pays off? As soon as your connections come through?" Each question emerged with increasing clarity, as if the fog I'd been living in was finally lifting. "How long have I been saying as soon as when it comes to you? 20 years? 30? Mom, you're upset. The doctor said you need to avoid stress. We should talk about this when you're feeling better." His tone shifted to concern. Another familiar tactic. Make it about my health, my emotional state, my inability to understand the sophisticated maneuvers he was executing on my behalf. "I'm not upset, Eric. I'm seeing clearly for the first time in years." The strange calm continued to flow through me, bringing with it a certainty I hadn't felt since Robert died. "I want you to listen carefully. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need honest answers." "Of course, Mom. Always honest with you." The sincerity in his voice almost sounded genuine. "How much of my money is left?" A pause. "Temporarily allocated to various investment strategies?" "How much, Eric?" Another pause, longer this time. "About 3,000. But that's going to change any minute. I'm due for a major—" "Where exactly is my wedding ring?" "Sunrise Pawn on Eastern Avenue." "But like I said, it's just temporary." "And where are you staying in Las Vegas?" "The Bellagio," he admitted, after a slight hesitation. But it's a business expense, Mom. You have to look successful to be successful. My new associates expect— I understand, I said, and for the first time, I truly did. I understood that I was hearing the same excuses, the same promises, the same temporary setbacks that had characterized my relationship with my younger son for most of his adult life. The only difference was that this time, I was listening with new ears. I'll be home tomorrow, Eric continued, relief evident in his voice as he sensed my apparent acceptance. We'll sort everything out then. I've got a meeting tonight with a guy who can change everything. By this time tomorrow, you'll be thanking me for taking initiative. I have one more question, Eric, I said, my hand tightening around the phone. If you were so certain about this investment, why didn't you tell me what you were doing? Why wait until I discovered it myself? The silence stretched between us like a chasm. That's what I thought, I said finally. Goodbye, Eric. Mom, wait. I ended the call and sat heavily in my office chair, surrounded by evidence of my son's betrayal. The broken desk drawer, the empty jewelry box, the bank statements showing withdrawals made while I lay in a hospital bed, uncertain if I would recover full functionality. My eyes fell on a framed photo on my desk. James, my older son, with his wife Caroline and their twin daughters in front of Buckingham Palace. The picture was 3 years old, from the last time I'd visited London. 3 years since I'd seen my older son and his family in person, though we spoke monthly by video call. 3 years because I'd always found reasons not to leave Phoenix for long. What if Eric needed me? What if he had another crisis? What if his next opportunity finally came through and I wasn't here to celebrate with him? How much of my life had been arranged around those what-ifs? My hand reached for the phone again, hovering over James's contact information. Eric's voice echoed in my memory, not from today's call, but from countless conversations over the years. Please don't tell James about this, Mom. You know how judgmental he is. He already thinks I'm a failure. Mom, promise me you won't mention this to James. He'd just use it as another reason to look down on me. If James finds out about this, he'll try to turn you against me. He's always been jealous of our relationship. I had honored those requests for decades, keeping Eric's struggles, failures, and temporary setbacks from his older brother, creating a chasm between my sons that widened with each secret kept, each crisis hidden, each truth obscured in the name of protecting Eric from judgment. My finger hovered over James's name, the one call Eric had always begged me never to make, the one call that might have prevented this moment had I made it years ago. The international ringtone sounded distant and foreign, much like my relationship with my eldest son had become over the years. 7 rings later, just as I was preparing myself for voicemail, James answered. Mom? His voice carried surprise and immediate concern. Is everything all right? It's the middle of the night here. The time difference. Of course. In my state of shock, I'd forgotten London was 8 hours ahead. It would be nearly 2 a.m. there. I'm sorry for calling so late, I began, my carefully rehearsed speech evaporating. What's happened? The sharpness in his tone reflected the lawyer he'd become, precise, efficient, cutting straight to relevant facts. Are you still in the hospital? No. I was discharged today. My voice sounded small, even to my own ears. James, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you years ago. The silence on the other end wasn't just distance or poor connection. It was decades of careful omissions stretching between us. It's Eric, isn't it? He finally said. I closed my eyes, feeling tears threaten. Yes. Is he in jail? Rehab? Hospital? Vegas, I answered, the single word carrying more explanation than any lengthy justification I could have offered. James exhaled slowly. What's he done this time, Mom? The question unlocked something in me. Not just the immediate crisis, but the pattern of behavior I'd enabled for decades. Words poured out in a torrent of belated honesty. I told him about the emptied accounts, the pawned wedding ring, the broken drawer, the elaborate excuses, the familiar promises. James listened without interruption until I ran out of words. All of it? He asked finally. He took everything? Except my house and pension, I confirmed. Those he couldn't access, though not for lack of trying. I found paperwork where he attempted to take a loan against the house. Thankfully, he needed my signature in person. Another long silence. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. His voice was gentle but firm. Is this really the first time? Or just the worst time? The question struck like a physical blow, forcing me to confront the careful fiction I'd maintained, not just to James but to myself. It's the worst, I admitted quietly. But no, not the first. There have been incidents, smaller amounts, things I classified as loans, though they were never repaid. How much, over the years? The lawyer's precision again. I had never calculated the total, never wanted to see the number that would reveal the magnitude of my enabling. But in the clarity of this moment, rough figures assembled themselves with uncomfortable accuracy. At least 70,000, I whispered. Before this, James's sharp intake of breath carried across oceans. And you never told me. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, an indictment of my decades-long choice to protect Eric at the expense of honesty with James. He always begged me not to tell you, said you already thought the worst of him, that you'd use it to drive us apart. The excuses sounded hollow, even as I spoke them. And you believed that. Again, not a question. I wanted to believe he could change. My voice cracked, that each time was the last time, that he just needed a little more support, a little more understanding. Mom, James said with a gentleness that broke my heart, you've been supporting and understanding him his entire life. At some point, it stopped being help and became something else. Enabling, I supplied, the word I'd refused to acknowledge during all those therapy sessions I'd arranged for Eric, but never attended myself. Yes, the simple confirmation held no judgment, no reproach, only recognition of a truth we both now acknowledged. What do I do now, James? I asked, the question carrying the weight of decades. First, we secure what's left. The decisive clarity in his voice offered a lifeline of competence. I'm going to email you contact information for Diane Mercer, a colleague in Phoenix who specializes in elder financial protection. She'll help you place immediate holds on all accounts, check your credit reports for any cards or loans Eric might have taken out in your name, and document everything for potential legal action. Legal action? I repeated, the words feeling foreign in relation to my son. Mom, he committed theft and fraud against his own mother while she was in the hospital. The steel in James's voice reflected more than professional assessment. Actions have consequences. Something Eric has apparently never had to face. I closed my eyes, remembering Eric as a toddler, his chubby hands reaching for me after each tumble, his absolute confidence that mother would always make everything better. When had that innocent dependence transformed into calculated exploitation? There's something else, James continued, his tone softening slightly. I think you should come to London. Stay with us for a while. I can't just leave, I protested automatically. My house? My responsibilities? Eric is a 42-year-old man who just stole his mother's life savings, James interrupted. And your house will still be there when you return. You need distance, Mom. Perspective. And frankly, protection from whatever scheme he tries next when he runs out of money in Vegas. The automatic objections rose to my lips, the same protective instincts that had shielded Eric from consequences his entire life. But something had shifted fundamentally inside me, some essential understanding of where maternal love ended and harmful enabling began. I'll think about it, I said finally. That's a start. The relief in his voice was palpable. Now about the immediate situation. When is Eric coming back from Vegas? Tomorrow, he says. With explanations and promises, I'm sure. And you'll be alone with him when he does. The flat statement carried implicit concern, one that might have offended me 24 hours earlier, but now resonated with uncomfortable truth. I had never feared my son physically, but his emotional manipulation had controlled my choices for decades. I'll call Diane first thing in the morning, I promised, and I'll consider London. There's one more thing, James said, hesitation entering his voice for the first time. Have you told Eric you've spoken to me? No? Good. Don't. The simple directive contained volumes of strategic thinking, the lawyer assessing the most effective approach, the brother protecting his mother, the son who had watched from a distance as his family's dynamics corroded under the weight of secrets and enabling. His reaction when he finds out will tell us everything we need to know, James added quietly. After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room, the emptied bank account still displayed on my laptop screen. For the first time in decades, I had shared the full truth about Eric with someone who couldn't be manipulated into excusing it. The relief was as overwhelming as the grief. My phone chimed with an incoming text from James. Just booked Diane to meet you at 9 a.m. She'll come to the house. "Try to rest, Mom. You're not alone in this anymore." The simple message carried more support than all the elaborate promises Eric had made over the years. As I prepared for bed in a house that felt both familiar and somehow changed, I wondered what tomorrow would bring when Eric returned to discover the one boundary he'd always counted on. My silence with James had finally been crossed. Diane Mercer arrived precisely at 9, a compact woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor and the focused efficiency of someone accustomed to emergency interventions. Her business card read, Elder Financial Protection Specialist, a title I would have bristled at just days ago. Now it felt like a lifeline. "James briefed me on the situation," she said, declining coffee as she arranged documents on my dining room table. "We need to move quickly to protect what's left and document everything for potential recovery actions." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of affidavits, account freezes, credit bureau alerts, and power of attorney documents limited specifically to financial protection. Diane took photographs of the broken desk drawer, the empty jewelry box, and printed out the bank statements showing the pattern of withdrawals that began hours after my hospitalization. "Your son was quite thorough," she observed without judgment as we reviewed the timeline. "Multiple withdrawals at different branches and ATMs, staying just under daily limits to avoid automatic fraud alerts. He always was clever," I said, the praise automatic before I caught myself. "Just never applied it to anything constructive." Diane's eyes held understanding rather than pity. "Mrs. Wilson, I want you to know that what you're experiencing is unfortunately common. Adult children exploiting parents, particularly widowed mothers, happens across all education levels and social backgrounds. This isn't about your intelligence or awareness. It's about the trust we naturally extend to our children." Her words offered small comfort against the magnitude of betrayal, but they helped dislodge some of the shame that had settled like a stone in my chest. "What happens when he comes back?" I asked as she packed her briefcase. "That depends on your decision about pursuing legal action," she replied carefully. "The documentation we've prepared today preserves that option without committing you to it yet. The most important thing now is maintaining clear boundaries." Clear boundaries. The concept seemed almost foreign after decades of blurry, shifting lines with Eric, where each transgression moved the threshold of acceptable behavior just a little further. "I've scheduled a locksmith to arrive at noon to change your locks," Diane continued. "James mentioned you're considering visiting London. I think that would be wise, at least until the immediate situation stabilizes." After she left, I sat at my dining room table surrounded by the paperwork of betrayal. Each form and affidavit a testament to trust violated and maternal love exploited. The house felt unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath for the confrontation to come. I didn't have to wait long. At 1:17 p.m., a taxi pulled up in front of my house. Eric emerged, looking surprisingly polished in clothes I suspected were newly purchased with my money. His confident stride up the walkway faltered slightly at the sight of the locksmith's van in the driveway. I watched through the living room window as confusion crossed his face, followed by the calculation I'd seen countless times before. The mental adjustment of narrative, the preparation of explanation, the arrangement of features into the expression most likely to achieve desired results. When he tried his key in the new lock, I opened the door before he could ring the bell. "Mom!" Surprise quickly transformed into the warm smile that had melted my resolve so many times before. "You changed the locks? You didn't need to do that. I have a key." He moved to embrace me, but I stepped back, maintaining the physical boundary Diane had encouraged. His arms dropped, confusion flickering across his face before the smile reasserted itself. "You look great. Hospital obviously took good care of you, much better than when I visited last week." The casual lie, he hadn't visited once during my 3-week stay, slid out with practiced ease. "Come in, Eric," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "We need to talk." His expression shifted as he entered the living room and saw the papers spread across the dining table. The locksmith, finishing the installation of a new deadbolt on the back door, nodded respectfully as he passed. "What's all this?" Eric asked, his tone carefully calibrated between curiosity and concern. "Mom, you shouldn't be stressing yourself with paperwork right after a stroke. I told you I'd handle everything." "Yes, you certainly did handle everything," I agreed, watching his eyes flicker between my face and the bank statements clearly visible on the table. For a moment, he seemed to consider continued denial, but something in my expression must have signaled the futility of that approach. His posture changed subtly, shoulders dropping, eyes widening, hands opening in a gesture of supplication that had accompanied countless confessions over the years. "Mom, I know how this looks," he began, his voice dropping to the contrite tone I knew so well. "But it's not what you think. I was trying to help you. Invest your money before inflation ate it all away. The financial advisors at the hospital said stroke recovery can take years, and your savings wouldn't last." There were no financial advisors at the hospital, Eric. The calm in my voice surprised even me. Just as there was no job interview yesterday, no hedge fund manager in Vegas, no system that can't fail. He blinked rapidly, recalibrating. "Okay, I didn't explain it well. I was trying to protect you from worrying. The opportunity came up suddenly, and I knew if I told you, you'd be conservative as always. Sometimes you have to take risks to get ahead, Mom. Risks with your own money, perhaps, not with your mother's entire life savings." I gestured to the chair across from me. "Sit down, please." He remained standing, wariness replacing contrition. "What are all these papers? Are those legal documents? Mom, you know you shouldn't sign anything without me reviewing it first. People take advantage of seniors all the time." The irony might have been amusing in different circumstances. "I'm well aware of people taking advantage," I replied. "That's why I've frozen all my accounts, placed a fraud alert on my credit report, and documented the unauthorized withdrawals you made while I was hospitalized." His face paled slightly, the practiced smile faltering. "That's crazy, Mom. I was authorized. You've always let me help with your finances. Remember when I set up your online banking? You gave me the passwords yourself, for emergencies and assistance, not to empty my accounts for gambling in Las Vegas." "It wasn't gambling." The flash of anger, quickly suppressed but revealing, was familiar. The pattern of our interactions had always followed this progression: denial, then justification, then momentary anger when those failed, followed by emotional manipulation. It was calculated investment with proven return potential, and it's going to pay off. I just need a little more time. "Where is my wedding ring, Eric?" The direct question seemed to catch him off guard. His hand moved unconsciously to his pocket, where I could see the outline of what was likely a pawn ticket. "Temporarily secured as collateral," he said, recovering quickly. "Completely safe. I'll retrieve it next week when what? When your ship comes in? When your system finally pays off? When your connections come through?" Each question seemed to physically impact him, his confident posture diminishing with each one. "I've been hearing those promises for 20 years, Eric. They've never once materialized." His eyes narrowed slightly, sensing a shift in our familiar dynamic. "What's happened to you, Mom? This isn't like you. Someone's been influencing you, filling your head with suspicions." His gaze fell on the legal papers again. "Who have you been talking to?" The question contained an edge I'd rarely heard directed at me, the same tone he used when describing people who didn't understand him or held him back or couldn't see his potential. For the first time, I was being categorized as a potential obstacle rather than a reliable resource. "I've been talking to people who actually have my best interests at heart," I said quietly. "Now I'd like you to leave." He stared at me as if I'd started speaking a foreign language. "Leave? Mom, you just got out of the hospital. You need someone to take care of you. I came back specifically to help you recover." "You came back because you ran out of money in Vegas," I corrected gently. "And I've made other arrangements for my recovery." Something shifted in his expression then, calculation giving way to genuine alarm as he realized the usual patterns weren't working. The manipulative smile disappeared, replaced by something harder and more authentic than anything I'd seen from him in years. "What other arrangements?" he demanded. "What have you done, Mom?" The question hung between us, laden with implications. What I'd done was finally recognize the true nature of our relationship. What I'd done was stop protecting him from the consequences of his actions. What I'd done was make the call he'd always feared. But I wasn't ready to reveal that particular card yet. "I've arranged for my financial protection," I said simply. "Now please, leave my house. You no longer have my permission to be here." His laugh held no humor. "You can't be serious. This is ridiculous. I'm your son." "Yes, you are, and I love you. But love doesn't mean allowing someone to steal from me. It doesn't mean enabling destruction." The words I'd never been able to say before flowed with surprising ease. "I'm asking you to leave now, Eric. Don't make me call someone to escort you out." For a moment, I glimpsed something unfamiliar in his eyes, something raw and unfiltered by manipulation or calculation. Fear, perhaps, or the dawning recognition that something fundamental had changed. "This isn't over," he said, finally backing toward the door. "You're not thinking clearly. The stroke, the medication, it's affecting your judgment. When you're feeling better, you'll understand what I was trying to do for you." His retreat to familiar excuses, my health, my supposed confusion, my inability to understand his sophisticated financial strategies, might have worked a week ago. But the woman who had awakened in that hospital room was not the same one who had entered it 3 weeks earlier. "Goodbye, Eric," I said firmly. "And please leave the pawn ticket for my wedding ring on the table before you go." The request, direct, unapologetic, without room for negotiation, seemed to finally convince him that our established patterns had truly been broken. With visible reluctance, he removed the ticket from his pocket and tossed it on the table. "You'll regret this, Mom," he said from the doorway, his tone holding more petulance than threat, "when you realize what I was trying to do for us." After he left, I sat in the sudden silence of my house, feeling both hollowed out and somehow fuller than before, emptied of illusions, but filled with a clarity that had been missing for decades. The confrontation had unfolded almost exactly as James had predicted, following the pattern of manipulation that had become so familiar I'd stopped recognizing it. But Eric hadn't yet discovered the most significant boundary I'd crossed. He didn't know about the call to James. That revelation, and his reaction to it, still waited in the wings, the final act in a play that had been running far too long. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of preparation and reflection. James and I spoke twice more, finalizing arrangements for my visit to London. Diane returned with additional documentation and the name of a trusted house-sitter who specialized in properties owned by seniors traveling abroad. My doctor provided clearance for international travel, noting that the change might actually benefit my recovery. "Stress reduction is essential after a stroke," Dr. Patel emphasized during my follow-up appointment. "And from what you've described, this situation with your son is exactly the kind of chronic stress you need to distance yourself from." Throughout these practical preparations, Eric maintained a strategic silence. No calls, no texts, no appearances at my door. The quiet felt ominous rather than peaceful, like the stillness before a storm. James had warned me to expect this. "He's regrouping," my older son had explained, recalculating his approach. The direct manipulation didn't work, so he'll be considering other angles. James understood his brother's patterns with a clarity I'd never allowed myself to achieve. While I had spent decades making excuses for Eric's behavior, James had been observing it with unfiltered perception from a distance. The storm broke on Wednesday evening, just as I was finishing dinner. A text message from an unknown number appeared on my phone. "Mom, my regular phone got stolen. This is my new temporary number. Need to talk to you urgently about your accounts. There's been a security breach. Call me ASAP. Eric." The transparent attempt to bypass my call screening might have worked in the past. Today, it simply confirmed how little Eric understood the fundamental change in our relationship. I forwarded the message to Diane without responding to Eric directly. 10 minutes later, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Eric standing on my porch with a middle-aged man in an ill-fitting suit. "Mom, please open the door," Eric called out, his voice carrying the urgent concern he had perfected over years of manufactured crises. "This is Mr. Peterson from Adult Protective Services. He needs to speak with you about a potential financial abuse situation." The audacity was breathtaking. I texted Diane again, then opened the door with the security chain still engaged. "Good evening," I said calmly. "I'd like to see some identification, please." The man beside Eric shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm Craig Peterson. Your son has expressed concerns about your welfare following your recent medical event." "Your official identification, please," I repeated, my teacher's voice emerging naturally after decades in the classroom. "Well, I'm not exactly with Adult Protective Services in an official capacity," he admitted, glancing at Eric. "I'm a consultant who works with families concerned about their elderly relatives' decision-making after health crises." Translation: not a government official, but someone paid to evaluate seniors whose financial decisions didn't align with their family's wishes. I'd read about such consultants in the materials Diane had provided. "Mr. Peterson, I appreciate your concern, I said firmly. However, I have been medically cleared by my neurologist, have consulted with an elder law attorney, and am not in need of evaluation. If you would like to speak with me legitimately, you may contact my attorney, whose information I'd be happy to provide. Eric's face darkened. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. This financial protection specialist you mentioned, she's taking advantage of you. We just want to make sure you're okay. I'm quite well, thank you, I replied, maintaining eye contact with the increasingly uncomfortable consultant. Mr. Peterson, I should inform you that I'm recording this interaction and have already contacted both my attorney and the actual Adult Protective Services to report this visit. Impersonating a government official is a serious offense in Arizona. This was a bluff. I wasn't recording anything, but the effect was immediate. Mr. Peterson took a step back from my door. I never claimed to be an official, he said quickly. Just here as a concerned professional at your son's request. No harm intended. Then I suggest you leave now, before any harm occurs. I shifted my gaze to Eric, whose expression had transformed from concerned son to thwarted manipulator. Both of you. As they retreated down my walkway, I heard Mr. Peterson hissing at Eric. You said she was confused and isolated. She sounds sharp as a tack to me. Don't involve me in family disputes again. I closed the door feeling shaken but oddly empowered. The confrontation confirmed what James and Diane had warned me about, that Eric would escalate his attempts to regain control as conventional manipulation failed. But it also proved I was capable of standing my ground, of seeing through the tactics that had worked on me for decades. My phone rang almost immediately. James, Diane just called me, he said without preamble. Are you okay? I'm fine. Your brother brought a fake evaluator to my door. It didn't work. Of course he did. James's voice held resigned familiarity rather than surprise. This is following the playbook exactly. Next, he'll try flying monkeys, mutual acquaintances who'll reach out to express concern about your behavior. Then possibly a direct appeal to your maternal guilt. When those fail, he'll likely move to anger and threats. You sound like you're describing a psychological operation rather than a son trying to communicate with his mother, I observed. That's exactly what it is, Mom. Eric has been running psychological operations on you for decades. The difference is that now you can recognize them for what they are. The harsh assessment hung between us, its truth undeniable despite my maternal instinct to soften it. Your flight is tomorrow evening, James continued, his tone gentling. Just hold firm until then. Caroline and the girls are setting up the guest room as we speak. They're excited to see you. The thought of my granddaughters, now 15 and navigating the complex world of adolescence, brought a smile to my face. How much of their growing up had I missed while managing Eric's perpetual crises? I'm looking forward to it, I said honestly, more than I can express. After hanging up, I continued my packing with renewed purpose. The small suitcase I'd brought home from the hospital now held carefully selected clothes for an extended stay abroad, my first real vacation in nearly a decade. The stark reality of that fact settled over me with uncomfortable clarity. How had I allowed my world to shrink so completely around Eric's needs and demands? The answer, of course, was incrementally, one canceled plan at a time, one emergency after another, one rationalization built upon the previous, until my life had narrowed to waiting for the next crisis, the next request, the next promise of change that never materialized. My phone chimed with incoming texts. Mom, please talk to me. You're making a huge mistake. People are taking advantage of your vulnerable state. Then, I was only trying to help you. Everything I've done has been for us, for our future. And finally, if you go through with whatever you're planning, you'll regret it. Some things can't be undone. The progression from plea to justification to veiled threat followed exactly the pattern James had predicted. I set the phone aside without responding, continuing my methodical packing as night settled over Phoenix. Tomorrow I would board a plane to London, putting physical distance between myself and the manipulative dynamics that had defined our relationship for too long. But the most significant distance had already been established. The emotional and psychological boundaries I'd finally found the strength to enforce. The one phone call Eric had always feared had become the catalyst for my long-delayed liberation. My last day in Phoenix dawned clear and bright, the desert light streaming through windows I'd carefully locked and checked twice the night before. Diane had arranged for a car service to take me to the airport, insisting it was safer than leaving my own car in long-term parking under the circumstances. The circumstances being, though neither of us said it explicitly, the unpredictable reactions of a son who had just lost his primary source of financial support and manipulation. As I finished my final preparations, the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw not Eric, but Helen Martinez, my neighbor of 15 years and occasional coffee companion. Her expression bore the worried frown I'd come to recognize as the universal signal of someone who had recently spoken to my son. The flying monkeys James had predicted, right on schedule. "Margaret," Helen began when I opened the door, her voice pitched with concern. "I ran into Eric at Starbucks this morning. He's terribly worried about you. Says you've been making some concerning decisions since your stroke. Is everything all right?" I invited her in, offering coffee more out of habit than genuine hospitality. As we settled at my kitchen table, the same spot where we'd shared dozens of conversations over the years, I considered how to respond. "Eric is understandably upset," I said carefully. "I've recently discovered that while I was in the hospital, he emptied my bank accounts and pawned my wedding ring to fund a gambling trip to Las Vegas." Helen's eyes widened, coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips. "He what?" "He took my life savings, over $150,000, along with emergency cash and family heirlooms." The simple facts, stated without emotional embellishment, carried their own weight. "But he told me you were being influenced by scammers," Helen said, confusion evident in her expression. "That you'd fallen for some kind of elder fraud scheme, that you're planning to leave the country based on their manipulation." I nodded, understanding exactly how Eric had framed the narrative. "I am leaving the country today, but to visit my older son in London, a trip I've postponed for years because I was always afraid to leave Eric unsupervised for too long." The admission carried a shameful recognition of my own enabling patterns. As for scammers, the only person who has taken financial advantage of me is my younger son. Helen set down her cup, processing this information against whatever persuasive story Eric had spun. I could almost see the mental recalibration happening. Memories of Eric's charm and explanations measured against the simple, unembellished truth I was offering. "I had no idea," she said finally. "He seemed so concerned about you, so focused on protecting you." "Eric has always been skilled at presenting himself as the caring, devoted son," I acknowledged. "It's a performance I enabled for far too long." After Helen left, somewhat dazed but no longer a proxy for Eric's manipulation, I completed my final preparations. The house sitter would arrive that afternoon. The security system was updated with new codes Eric didn't know, and Diane had arranged for regular property checks by a local service. My phone continued its steady stream of messages from Eric, each one employing a different emotional lever he'd successfully used in the past. "Mom, please don't do this. I'm worried sick about you. I know I made a mistake, but cutting me off completely is cruel. After everything I've done for you over the years. What about my housing situation? You know my apartment lease is up next month. Where am I supposed to go? If you leave like this, don't expect things to be the same when you come back. Some bridges can't be rebuilt." Each message revealed a different facet of the manipulation that had characterized our relationship. Concern, guilt, dependency, threat. Each one designed to provoke a specific response that would maintain his access and control. For the first time, I could see these tactics clearly for what they were. The stroke hadn't just been a health crisis. It had somehow cleared away the fog of maternal justification that had clouded my perception for decades. At 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang again. This time, it was Carmen from the car service, arriving early to ensure we wouldn't be rushed. As she loaded my suitcases into the town car, I took one last look at the house that had been my home for 30 years, where Robert and I had raised our boys, where I'd lived alone since his death, where I'd gradually surrendered my independence to Eric's carefully orchestrated dependencies. When I returned, it would be as someone different. Someone who had finally found the strength to love her son without enabling his destruction. Whether Eric could accept that new reality remained to be seen. The drive to Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport passed in contemplative silence. Carmen, sensing my mood, respected my quiet reflection, offering only practical information about our route and estimated arrival time. As we approached the terminal, my phone rang. Eric's number. After 4 days of texts and voicemails, this was his first direct call since our confrontation. I let it go to voicemail, but the screen immediately lit up again and again. On the fourth consecutive call, I finally answered. "Hello, Eric. Where are you?" His voice carried an edge I rarely heard directed at me, something harder and colder than his usual manipulative warmth. "Your neighbor said you're leaving the country. That can't be true." "I'm at the airport," I confirmed, maintaining the calm I'd practiced with Diane. "I'm going to visit James and his family in London." "You can't do that." The entitlement in his tone was breathtaking. "We haven't resolved anything here. What about my situation? What about the plans we discussed for getting your finances back on track?" We had discussed no such plans, but the fictional shared agreement was another familiar tactic, creating false consensus to establish compliance. "My financial situation is being addressed," I said simply, "just not in the way you're suggesting." A calculated pause, then a tactical shift. "Mom, I'm really worried about you. This isn't like you, shutting me out, making rash decisions, leaving the country suddenly. It's like you've become a different person since the stroke. The doctors warned this might happen. Personality changes, impaired judgment. The concerned son, worried about his mother's health. It might have worked a month ago. My neurologist has cleared me for travel and confirmed my cognitive functions are intact," I replied. "But you're right about one thing. I have changed. I finally recognized patterns I was blind to before." Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its performative concern, replaced by something colder and more authentic. "You've been talking to James, haven't you?" The question I'd been waiting for, the moment of revelation I'd both dreaded and anticipated, the boundary-crossing Eric had always feared most. "Yes," I said simply. "I have." The silence that followed contained multitudes: shock, betrayal, rage, calculation. When Eric finally spoke, his voice had transformed completely, the manipulative masks falling away to reveal something raw and ugly beneath. "You promised you'd never go behind my back to him. You swore it, Mom. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? By running to James with lies about me?" "I didn't lie, Eric. I simply told him the truth, something I should have done years ago." "He's turned you against me." The accusation emerged as a snarl. "He's always been jealous of our relationship, always wanted to control you, control your money, and now he's finally gotten to you." "No one has turned me against you," I said quietly as Carmen pulled up to the departure terminal. "Your actions have done that all on their own. You'll regret this," he said, his voice dropping to a cold whisper that raised goosebumps on my arms despite the Arizona heat. "When you come crawling back after James gets what he wants from you, don't expect me to be waiting. You've made your choice, and it's the wrong one." As I stepped from the car into the bustling terminal, Eric's final words followed me like a shadow. "You're dead to me now, just like Dad." The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me standing with my suitcase in one hand and my phone in the other, surrounded by travelers rushing toward destinations and reunions. The cruelty of his parting shot, invoking Robert, whose death had devastated us both, should have broken me. Instead, it confirmed what James, Diane, and my own awakening clarity had been telling me. The son I thought I knew, the son I had protected and enabled and excused for decades, was largely a creation of my own wishful thinking. As I made my way through security and toward the international terminal, I felt both lighter and heavier, unburdened by the weight of denial I'd carried for so long, but laden with the grief of seeing my son clearly for perhaps the first time. The flight to London would take 11 hours. Somewhere over the Atlantic, I would leave behind not just a continent, but a lifetime of enabling that had served neither of us well. What awaited on the other side remained uncertain, but it would begin with truth, the foundation that had been missing from my relationship with Eric for far too long. London greeted me with characteristic drizzle and overcast skies, the soft gray light, a gentle contrast to Phoenix's relentless sunshine. As I emerged from customs at Heathrow, weary from the long flight but curiously energized, I scanned the waiting crowd for familiar faces. "Gran!" Twin voices called out in unison, and suddenly my granddaughters were there, Sophia and Emma, 15 years old and vibrating with excited energy. Behind them stood James and Caroline, smiling broadly despite the early hour. The girls reached me first, enveloping me in enthusiastic hugs that nearly toppled my luggage cart. They had grown so much since our video calls, transforming from the children I remembered into young women on the cusp of adulthood. Their identical faces, James's eyes, Caroline's smile, beamed up at me with genuine delight. "We've been counting down the days," Emma announced, taking control of my cart with cheerful authority. "We've planned everything. The museums you'll love, the gardens that are blooming now, even a weekend in Bath where they filmed those Jane Austen adaptations you're always talking about. We redecorated the guest room too," Sophia added. "Dad said you might stay for a while, so we wanted it to feel properly yours." As the girls chattered happily, James stepped forward to embrace me, a rare physical demonstration from my usually reserved older son. "Welcome to London, Mom," he said softly. "You made it." Those 3 simple words carried layers of meaning beyond the obvious. Acknowledgement of the difficult decision, the emotional boundary crossing, the long-delayed prioritization of this relationship over the constant crises of the other. Carolyn hugged me next, her warmth a balm after the tensions of the past week. "We're so glad you're here," she said, her slight Scottish accent still noticeable after decades in England. "For however long you need." The drive from Heathrow to their home in Hampstead passed in a blur of conversation and reconnection. The girls dominated the discussion, updating me on school achievements, social developments, and the various activities they had planned for my visit. Their enthusiasm created a protective bubble of normalcy that allowed me to temporarily set aside the painful confrontation with Eric and the uncertain future awaiting my return to Phoenix. James and Caroline's home, a lovely Victorian townhouse on a tree-lined street, welcomed me with warmth that had nothing to do with central heating and everything to do with the obvious thought that had gone into my arrival. The guest room had indeed been transformed, with fresh flowers on the nightstand, a small bookshelf filled with novels I'd mentioned enjoying during our video calls, and framed photos of family moments I'd missed over the years. "We thought you might like to rest before dinner," Caroline said, showing me where everything was located. The girls wanted to prepare a welcome feast. "They've been practicing recipes all week." "That sounds lovely," I replied, genuinely touched by the effort. "Though I may need a short nap first to adjust to the time difference." Left alone in the peaceful room, I finally allowed myself to fully process the magnitude of what had happened. Not just Eric's betrayal and our confrontation, but my presence here in London, prioritizing this branch of my family after years of focusing primarily on Eric's constant needs. As I unpacked my suitcase, placing carefully folded clothes into drawers and hanging others in the wardrobe, I noticed a small wrapped package on the pillow that I'd initially overlooked. The card attached simply read, "Welcome Gran," in twin handwriting. Inside was a beautiful leather-bound journal with my initials embossed on the cover, along with a note explaining it was for recording my London adventures and any other thoughts you might need to work through. The thoughtfulness of the gift, acknowledging both the joy of my visit and the difficult circumstances that had prompted it, brought unexpected tears. After a brief nap, I joined the family downstairs to find the dining room transformed for a celebration. The girls had indeed prepared a feast: roast chicken, vegetables, and James's favorite treacle tart for dessert. A hand-lettered banner reading, "Welcome to London, Gran," hung across one wall. Decorated with drawings of London landmarks and family inside jokes I was surprised they remembered from our limited time together. "A toast," James said, raising his glass once we were all seated. "To new beginnings and long overdue reunions." As glasses clinked and conversation flowed, I felt a curious sensation of homecoming. Not to a place, but to relationships untainted by manipulation and hidden agendas. The contrast between this genuine warmth and the calculated performances that had characterized my interactions with Eric threw my decades of enabling into stark relief. Later that evening, after the girls had gone to bed, James, Caroline, and I sat in their comfortable living room with cups of tea. The time had come for the conversation we'd been gently avoiding during the welcoming festivities. "How are you really doing, Mom?" James asked, his lawyer's precision momentarily set aside in favor of simple concern. "I'm processing," I admitted. "Everything happened so quickly. The stroke, discovering what Eric had done, making the decision to come here. I haven't fully absorbed it all yet." "That's understandable," Caroline said gently. "It's a lot of change in a very short time." James leaned forward slightly, his expression carefully neutral. "Has Eric contacted you since you left?" "Not since our conversation as I was leaving for the airport. I briefly recounted Eric's final words, his cold declaration that I was dead to him now. James and Caroline exchanged a glance that contained volumes of unspoken communication, the shorthand of a long, healthy partnership that made my heart ache for what I'd lost when Robert died. "I should tell you," James said finally, "that Eric has been trying to contact me directly. Multiple calls, texts, even emails to my work address. This surprised me. What does he want?" "Initially, to convince me that you're experiencing post-stroke confusion and making irrational decisions. When that didn't work, he shifted to accusations that I'm manipulating you to gain control of your assets." James's mouth twisted in a wry smile. "When that didn't get the response he wanted either, he moved to offering me a partnership in managing your affairs, suggesting we could both benefit if we worked together instead of against each other. The calculated progression from concern to accusation to proposed collusion was so characteristically Eric that it might have been comical if it weren't so painful." "What did you say to him?" I asked. "Nothing. After the initial exchange, where I made it clear I was aware of what he'd done. I've documented everything but haven't engaged. Diane advised that was the best approach, and I agreed." Caroline reached over to squeeze my hand. "We know this is incredibly difficult, Margaret. Recognizing manipulation from someone you love is painful enough. When it's your child," she trailed off, unable to fully articulate the unique anguish of a mother seeing her son clearly for the first time. "The hardest part," I admitted, "is reconciling the son I thought I had with the person he's actually shown himself to be. I keep wondering where I went wrong, what I could have done differently." "Mom," James said gently, "Eric's behavior isn't your failure. You loved him. You supported him. You gave him every opportunity to become his best self. The choices he made with those opportunities were his alone. The simple absolution, offered without judgment or resentment for the years I'd prioritized Eric's needs over James's, broke something open inside me. Tears I'd been holding back since discovering Eric's betrayal finally flowed freely, years of denied reality washing away in their release. Caroline moved to sit beside me on the sofa, her arm around my shoulders offering silent support. James handed me tissues and waited patiently, as I gave voice to regrets and recognitions that had been building for decades. "I enabled him," I finally acknowledged aloud. "I made excuses, covered for him, rescued him from consequences. I thought I was being a good mother, but I was actually preventing him from ever having to grow up or take responsibility." "You were doing what you thought was right," Caroline said, "with the best of intentions. But the impact was harmful to him, to me, to my relationship with you." I looked at James, seeing in his face the boy who had grown into a man largely without my witness. "I missed so much of your life because I was always managing Eric's crises." "I understood more than you might think," James replied. "Dad and I used to talk about it when I was in college. His concerns about the patterns developing with Eric, your instinct to protect and rescue. He worried about what would happen after he was gone." The revelation that Robert had seen the unhealthy dynamic developing, had discussed it with our older son while I remained blind to it, added another layer to my grief and self-recrimination. "Why didn't he say something to me?" I asked. James's smile held gentle understanding. "He did, Mom. Many times. You just weren't ready to hear it." The truth of this statement resonated painfully. How many conversations with Robert had I deflected or dismissed when they touched on Eric's patterns? How many gentle suggestions had I countered with defensive justifications? "The question now," Caroline said pragmatically, "is what happens next, not just with Eric, but with your life moving forward." It was the question I'd been avoiding since boarding the plane in Phoenix, looking ahead rather than back, considering possibilities beyond the narrow constraints I'd accepted for so long. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "For now, I just need time. Time to heal, time to think, time to rediscover who I am beyond being Eric's safety net and crisis manager." "Then that's what this visit will be," James said simply, "for however long you need it to be." As I retired to my room that night, exhausted but somehow lighter, I found myself reaching for the journal my granddaughters had given me. On the first blank page, I wrote a single sentence. Today, I began to understand the difference between loving a child and enabling his destruction. It wasn't much, just one small truth among many I would need to face in the weeks ahead. But it was a beginning. And for tonight, that was enough. London worked its gentle magic over the following weeks. Spring bloomed across the city, parks transformed with explosions of daffodils and cherry blossoms, and I slowly found my footing in this new, unburdened reality. The girls proved to be enthusiastic tour guides, proud to show their American grandmother the city they called home. James and Caroline created space for healing without pressure, their home offering sanctuary without interrogation. My days developed a rhythm that felt both novel and nurturing. Mornings often began with coffee in their small garden, watching urban birds flit among budding branches. Afternoons might include exploring museums with the girls, walking Hampstead Heath with Caroline, or sometimes simply reading in peaceful solitude, an activity that had become increasingly rare in Phoenix as Eric's demands consumed more of my attention and energy. 3 weeks into my stay, I realized with a start that I had gone entire days without thinking about Eric or the situation awaiting my eventual return. The constant low-grade anxiety that had become so familiar, I'd stopped recognizing it. The vigilance for the next crisis, the anticipation of the next request, the preparation for the next emotional manipulation, had gradually receded, leaving space for a calm I had nearly forgotten was possible. "You look different," Sophia observed one afternoon as we sat in the National Gallery, contemplating Turner's atmospheric landscapes. "More present." Out of the mouths of teenagers, unexpected wisdom. "Present is a good word for it," I agreed. "I think I've been absent from my own life for longer than I realized." She nodded with the serious consideration 15-year-olds sometimes bring to adult conversations. "Dad says you were always putting out fires for Uncle Eric. That must have been exhausting." The simple acknowledgement, free from judgment or expectation, invited honest reflection rather than defensive justification. "It was," I admitted. "But when you're in the middle of a pattern like that, you don't recognize how consuming it's become. It feels normal because it's familiar, even when it's destructive." Sophia considered this, her gaze returning to Turner's swirling light and shadow. "Like those people in the painting who can't see the storm coming because they're too focused on what's right in front of them." The insight startled me with its precision. Exactly like that. On my 1-month London anniversary, as the girls had dubbed it, James and Caroline arranged a special dinner at a riverside restaurant. The conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from the girls' school projects to Caroline's research work to James's recent legal cases. Normal family discussion, unmarked by crisis or manipulation, the kind I had experienced too rarely in recent years. Over dessert, James gently steered the conversation toward practical matters. "Mom, have you given any thought to how long you'd like to stay? You're welcome as long as you want. Indefinitely, if that feels right. But I thought you might appreciate discussing options." The question carried no pressure, simply opening space for planning rather than drifting. Another contrast with Eric's approach, where discussions of the future were always framed to engineer specific outcomes rather than explore genuine possibilities. "I've been thinking about it," I acknowledged. "As wonderful as this has been, I do need to return to Phoenix eventually. My house is there, my medical providers, my community." "And Eric," Caroline added gently. "Yes," I agreed, "though I'm still determining what that relationship looks like moving forward." James nodded. "Diane has been keeping me updated on the practical side. Your house sitter reports everything is secure, your accounts remain protected, and there have been no further attempts to access your finances." "What about Eric himself?" I asked, realizing I'd deliberately avoided requesting this information until now. James and Caroline exchanged one of their communicative glances before he answered. "He's made several more attempts to contact me, each one following the pattern we discussed, beginning with concern about your welfare, shifting to accusations when that doesn't work, then offering cooperation that would benefit us both. When those approaches failed," Caroline continued carefully, "he tried contacting the girls through social media. Nothing threatening," she added quickly, seeing my alarm. "Just attempting to establish direct communication, presumably to gain information or potentially influence you through them." The calculated targeting of my granddaughters, using children to manipulate a situation, represented a new level of tactical maneuvering that made my stomach tighten. "We monitored the situation," James assured me. "The girls are remarkably perceptive. They recognized the pattern immediately and didn't engage." Sophia and Emma exchanged their own knowing look, mirror images of adolescent wisdom beyond their years. "He wasn't very subtle," Emma observed dryly. First message was, "I'm so worried about your grandmother." And the second was already asking if you'd mentioned when you're coming back to America. "We talked about it with Dad," Sophia added, "about how some people try to use kids as information pipelines between adults. We've seen it with friends whose parents are divorced. Their matter-of-fact assessment, free from the emotional entanglement that had clouded my own perception for decades, highlighted how clearly manipulative behavior can appear when viewed without the distortion of enablement. Beyond these attempts at contact," James continued, "Diane reports that Eric appears to have moved in with a friend after being unable to renew his apartment lease. He's made no further attempts to access your house or accounts." The practical update created a curious mixture of maternal concern and necessary detachment. I still cared about Eric's welfare, would always care, regardless of his actions, but I was learning to separate that care from responsibility for managing his adult life. "I think I'd like to stay through May," I said, making the decision as I spoke it. "That would give me 2 more weeks here, then return to Phoenix in early June when the worst heat hasn't yet set in." "Perfect timing," Caroline said warmly. "That gives us the bank holiday weekend to take that trip to Bath we've been planning." As dinner concluded and we strolled along the Thames embankment, lights reflecting on the dark water, I felt a deepening certainty about the path forward. Returning to Phoenix wouldn't mean returning to old patterns. The boundaries I'd established, both practical and emotional, would remain firmly in place, allowing for potential healing without enabling further destruction. Later that night, I added another entry to the journal that had become a trusted companion during my London stay. The greatest challenge of motherhood isn't protecting your children from consequences, but finding the courage to let them face the reality their choices have created. True love sometimes means stepping back rather than rushing in, a lesson it has taken me far too long to learn. 2 days later, an email arrived from Diane with news that shifted my planning once again. The local police had contacted her as my legal representative. Eric had been arrested for attempting to pawn stolen jewelry. The items in question had been taken from the home of the friend who had offered him temporary housing. The cycle of manipulation, desperation, and self-destruction had continued in my absence, finding new targets when I was no longer available to rescue and enable. The knowledge brought grief, but also confirmation that my boundaries had been necessary, not just for my own protection, but for any hope of Eric eventually confronting the reality of his choices. With James's support, I arranged for limited legal assistance for Eric, ensuring he had proper representation without directly intervening in the consequences of his actions. It was a delicate balance, maintaining basic maternal care without slipping back into the enabling patterns that had characterized our relationship for decades. That evening, as I sat in the garden watching spring twilight settle over London, Caroline joined me with cups of tea. "Difficult news today," she observed simply. "Yes," I accepted the tea gratefully, though not entirely surprising. "What are you thinking?" Her question carried genuine curiosity rather than agenda. Another refreshing contrast with my interactions with Eric, that I've spent years trying to prevent exactly this kind of situation, I replied, after careful consideration. Every intervention, every loan, every excuse I made for his behavior was supposedly to keep him from hitting rock bottom. But in reality, I was just postponing the inevitable while enabling the patterns that made it more likely. Caroline nodded. Rock bottom is different for everyone. Some people need to reach it before change becomes possible. And some people bounce and keep digging, I added, with the dark humor that had become part of my coping mechanism. True, she acknowledged, but you can love someone without being responsible for catching them every time they fall. The simple truth, spoken without judgment or expectation, crystallized something I'd been struggling to articulate since discovering Eric's betrayal. Love and enabling were not synonymous. Care and responsibility were not the same thing. I could maintain maternal love for my son while establishing firm boundaries against his destructive behaviors. My return to Phoenix would come sooner than planned, necessitated by Eric's legal situation, but I would carry with me the clarity and strength fostered during my London sanctuary. Whatever awaited, court proceedings, difficult conversations, uncertain reconciliation, I would face it with newly discovered resilience and the knowledge that loving my son didn't mean sacrificing my own well-being on the altar of his continuous crises. As I prepared for bed that night, I found a small package outside my door, another gift from my granddaughters. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with 2 charms, a phoenix and a bridge. The accompanying note read, "For when you return to Phoenix, to remember you can rise from ashes and that London will always be a bridge back to us whenever you need it. Love, S&E." Their symbolic understanding of my journey brought fresh tears, not of grief this time, but of gratitude for the connections I was reclaiming and strengthening, even as others underwent necessary transformation. Tomorrow, I would book my flight back to Arizona. Whatever awaited there, I would no longer face it alone. The Arizona heat hit me like a physical wall as I exited Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, the familiar dry intensity a stark contrast to London's gentle spring. James had insisted on accompanying me, despite my protests that I could handle the situation alone. "It's not about capability, Mom," he'd explained with characteristic directness. "It's about support. You shouldn't have to face this by yourself." His presence beside me now, calm, competent, unfazed by the heat in his lightweight suit, provided an anchor as we navigated the transition from family sanctuary back to the scene of betrayal and necessary confrontation. Diane met us at the arrivals curb, her efficient handshake with James confirming their ongoing communication during my absence. The drive to her office passed with practical updates. Eric remained in county custody awaiting arraignment, his bail set higher than standard due to flight risk concerns. My home was secure, the house-sitter having maintained both property and privacy admirably. All financial protections remained in place, with no further attempts to access accounts detected. "The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning," she concluded as we settled in her cool, minimalist office. "You're not required to attend, but given your decision to provide limited support, your presence might influence the proceedings positively." "I'll be there," I confirmed, my resolve strengthened by the month of clarity London had provided. Not to rescue, but to witness. James nodded approvingly, understanding the significant distinction. The next phase unfolded with precise practicality, reviewing legal documentation, establishing clear parameters for the support I was willing to provide, and preparing for possible scenarios at tomorrow's hearing. Throughout the process, I maintained the calm certainty that had gradually replaced anxiety during my time away. Whatever happened next would be navigated with clear boundaries and eyes fully open to reality rather than wishful thinking. My house, when we finally arrived late that afternoon, felt simultaneously familiar and foreign. The physical space unchanged, but my perception of it fundamentally altered. The house-sitter had maintained it beautifully, even refreshing the garden with desert-appropriate spring blooms. "It feels smaller somehow," I observed as we settled in the living room that had witnessed so many cycles of Eric's crises and promises. "That happens when you expand your perspective," James replied thoughtfully. "London gave you breathing room, literally and figuratively." That evening, as James took a business call in the guest room, I found myself drawn to Eric's old bedroom, preserved largely unchanged since his high school years, despite his having lived independently, at least nominally, for over 2 decades. The shrine-like quality of the space struck me now as part of the pattern I'd maintained, keeping his childhood symbolically intact while enabling his failure to fully mature. Yearbooks, sports trophies, childhood artwork, all carefully preserved, while I simultaneously lamented his inability to function as an adult. The contradiction was painfully obvious now. How could he fully embrace adult identity when I maintained this monument to his youth, ready to welcome him back to childhood safety whenever adult consequences loomed? With sudden clarity, I opened the closet and found empty boxes from the garage. By the time James finished his call, I had methodically packed most of the room's memorabilia, leaving only the furniture and basic decor. "Spring cleaning?" he asked from the doorway, observing my systematic dismantling of the shrine. "Reality cleaning," I corrected. "This room has been waiting for a 17-year-old boy to return for 25 years. That boy doesn't exist anymore, and maintaining this pretense hasn't helped the man he became." James nodded, understanding without need for further explanation. "Need help with those boxes?" Together we carried them to the garage, stacking them neatly along one wall, preserved but no longer enshrined, neither discarded completely nor centrally displayed. A metaphor, perhaps, for the relationship I hoped might eventually be possible with my younger son. Morning arrived with desert clarity, the sharp light and distant mountains creating a backdrop of stark beauty for the difficult day ahead. I dressed carefully in clothing that projected calm capability rather than either maternal softness or punitive severity, a balance I had considered thoughtfully while packing in London. The courthouse loomed institutional and imposing, its architecture designed to emphasize the authority of law over individual circumstance. Inside, the bureaucratic process moved with impersonal efficiency: security screening, directional guidance, waiting room assignment. James and Diane flanked me like protective sentinels as we entered the assigned courtroom, taking seats that offered clear view of proceedings without placing us prominently in Eric's line of sight. Other cases preceded his on the docket, each one dispatched with brisk judicial economy, human complexity reduced to charges, pleas, and procedural decisions. When Eric was finally brought in, the physical shock of his appearance momentarily overwhelmed my careful emotional preparations. Just 6 weeks had passed since our confrontation in my living room, but he seemed to have aged years, his face gaunt, his confident posture replaced by the shuffling wariness of someone navigating unfamiliar institutional terrain. The orange jumpsuit hung loosely on his frame, suggesting weight lost through stress rather than intention. For a brief, piercing moment, maternal instinct surged, the visceral urge to rush forward, to fix, to protect, to somehow make this all go away and restore the son I remembered rather than the stranger before me. James must have sensed this internal struggle, his hand gently covering mine in silent support and reminder of the boundaries we had so carefully constructed. Eric didn't notice our presence immediately. His attention focused on his court-appointed attorney and the procedural requirements of his position. When he finally scanned the courtroom, perhaps seeking familiar faces or assessing potential support, his eyes widened upon seeing me, a complex series of emotions flashing across his features too quickly to fully interpret. Surprise gave way to calculation, then something that might have been shame before settling into a carefully constructed expression of contrition and suffering clearly designed to evoke maternal sympathy. The performance was so familiar, so aligned with patterns I had observed for decades, that recognizing it provided unexpected immunization against its intended effect. The proceedings themselves were brief and procedural. Charges read, rights explained, plea entered, not guilty, despite evidence including security camera footage of the pawning attempt. Bail discussion revisited and maintained at its previous level due to flight risk concerns. Throughout, Eric's gaze returned repeatedly to me, each glance carrying unspoken appeals and assumptions. When the judge asked if anyone was present to speak regarding bail considerations, I remained seated despite Eric's expectant look. The boundary held, firm but not punitive, present but not rescuing. After the hearing concluded and Eric was led back to custody, his attorney approached us in the hallway. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm David Reynolds, your son's public defender." His handshake was firm, his expression professionally neutral. "Eric indicated you might be willing to post bail." "I'm afraid Eric is mistaken," I replied calmly. "I'm here to understand the situation and provide limited support through proper legal channels, but I won't be posting bail." The attorney's expression revealed no surprise, suggesting Eric's promises about maternal rescue might have seemed questionable from the beginning. "I understand. In that case, would you be open to speaking with him briefly? He's requested a meeting." I glanced at James and Diane, both of whom gave slight nods indicating support for whatever decision I made. Yes, I decided, but with my attorney present. The meeting room offered little privacy and less comfort. Institutional furnishings designed for functionality rather than ease. Security glass separating visitors from inmates, monitors ensuring compliance with facility regulations. Eric entered with the uncertain movements of someone still adjusting to institutional constraints, his eyes finding mine immediately. "Mom," he began as soon as he sat down, voice pitched to carry through the perforated barrier. "Thank God you're here. This is all a huge misunderstanding. Dennis completely overreacted. I was just borrowing those items temporarily. He knew I was good for it." The familiar pattern, denial, minimization, reframing of clear transgression as misunderstanding, emerged immediately, as predictable as sunrise over the desert. "The security camera at the pawn shop suggests otherwise," I replied quietly. His expression flickered momentarily before regaining its earnest appeal. "Look, I was desperate. After what happened with you, I had nowhere to turn, no resources, no support system. I was literally homeless when Dennis took me in. What was I supposed to do? The attempt to transfer responsibility, to position his theft as my fault for withdrawing financial support, was another familiar tactic, one that had successfully triggered my guilt reflexes for decades. You were supposed to make better choices, Eric, I said simply. As we all are. His facade cracked slightly, frustration bleeding through. Why are you being like this? Why did you come back from London, if not to help me? Is this James's influence? Has he finally turned you against me completely? No one has turned me against you, I replied, maintaining calm despite his escalating emotion. Your actions have created this situation, not James, not me. So you're just going to let me rot in jail? Your own son? After everything I've done for you over the years? His voice rose, drawing a warning glance from the monitoring officer. The question hung between us, its premise so fundamentally inverted from reality that it momentarily left me speechless. After everything he had done for me? The breathtaking reversal of our actual relationship history revealed how completely Eric had reconstructed our past to position himself as caretaker rather than dependent. Eric, I said finally, leaning slightly forward, I'm here because I'm your mother, and I care about your welfare. But caring doesn't mean enabling behaviors that harm yourself and others. It doesn't mean shielding you from the natural consequences of your choices. What does that even mean? He demanded, frustration sharpening his tone. It means you're abandoning me when I need you most. Some mother, the attempted guilt trigger, challenging my maternal identity itself, might once have shattered my resolve. Today, it simply confirmed the necessity of maintaining firm boundaries. I've arranged for you to have proper legal representation, I explained calmly. I've also connected your attorney with information about rehabilitation programs that work with the court system for cases involving addiction issues. I don't have addiction issues, he snapped. I have money issues. Issues that would be solved immediately if you just post bail and provide basic support like any normal parent would. I met his gaze steadily. The path forward isn't through me providing financial rescue again. It's through you finally facing the reality your choices have created. His expression hardened, calculation replacing appeal as he realized standard manipulation tactics weren't working. Fine. If that's your position, don't expect anything from me in the future. When you're old and need care, remember this moment. The threat, linking future caregiving to current compliance, represented his ultimate leverage attempt, one that might have devastated me 6 weeks earlier. Now, it simply revealed the transactional nature of his understanding of family relationships. I love you, Eric, I said quietly as I rose to leave. That hasn't changed and won't change, but how we relate to each other must change if there's any hope for healing. As James and I drove away from the detention facility, the morning sun illuminated the mountains surrounding Phoenix with stark clarity, every crevice and contour visible in the brilliant light. No detail obscured by shadow or distance. It seemed an appropriate metaphor for this new phase of my relationship with Eric, painful in its clarity, but ultimately more honest than the comforting shadows of denial had ever been. You did well, James observed simply, as we navigated back toward my house. It didn't feel like a victory, I admitted. It wasn't meant to be, just necessary. The simplicity of his assessment, free from both celebration and condemnation, offered the perfect closing note to this first difficult encounter. Not victory, not defeat, just necessary reality, finally acknowledged after decades of elaborate evasion. The call I had made from my hospital room, the one Eric had always begged me never to make, had indeed changed everything. Not by magic or immediate transformation, but by finally introducing truth into a relationship long sustained by mutual fiction. His reaction, anger, manipulation, attempted guilt transference, simply confirmed how necessary that truth had been. What came next remained uncertain, dependent on choices Eric alone could make. But for the first time in decades, those choices would not be made within the artificial environment of maternal rescue and enablement. They would be made in the clarifying light of reality, harsh, perhaps, but offering the only genuine path toward potential healing. Summer descended on Phoenix with characteristic intensity, the heat transforming daily routines into careful calculations of timing and exposure. My life settled into new patterns, different from both the crisis-centered existence I'd maintained before my stroke and the sanctuary I'd found in London. This new reality contained elements of both, the practical independence of my pre-stroke life, combined with the clear boundaries and self-care I'd discovered abroad. James had returned to London after 2 weeks, once we were confident that appropriate systems were in place for both my well-being and Eric's situation. His departure came with firm plans for Christmas in London and regular video calls that now included actual conversation rather than crisis management disguised as updates. Eric's legal process unfolded with bureaucratic deliberation. The evidence against him, security footage, pawnshop records, witness statements, eventually led his attorney to recommend a plea agreement rather than trial. The final arrangement included restitution to his friend Dennis, 12 months probation, mandatory addiction counseling, and community service. Throughout these proceedings, I maintained the boundaries we had established, present but not rescuing, supportive of recovery efforts but not enabler of avoidance. This delicate balance represented terrain I had never successfully navigated before, requiring constant vigilance against the undertow of old patterns. Diane proved invaluable during this period, her professional experience providing guardrails when my maternal instincts threatened to override carefully considered boundaries. When Eric's attorney suggested I provide housing during probation, she helped articulate alternative options that supported recovery without returning to enabling patterns. When financial requests emerged disguised as recovery necessities, she helped distinguish between appropriate support and unhealthy subsidy. Eric himself cycled through predictable stages as the reality of his situation solidified. Initial anger and blame gave way to performative remorse, then to grudging compliance with court requirements, then to tentative engagement with counseling resources. Whether this progression represented genuine evolution or simply tactical adaptation remained unclear, an uncertainty his counselor acknowledged during our one permitted conversation. Recovery isn't linear, the counselor explained after obtaining Eric's required permission to speak with me, especially with behavioral addictions like gambling, where relapse rates are high and insight often develops in fits and starts. The key factor is whether he's doing recovery for external approval or internal healing. How can I tell the difference? I asked, genuinely uncertain after decades of navigating Eric's performances. You probably can't, at least not reliably, he admitted. That's why maintaining consistent boundaries is so important. They provide stability regardless of where he is in his internal process. This perspective, that boundaries served a positive purpose beyond self-protection, helped resolve the lingering conflict between maternal care and necessary limitation. My consistency wasn't punishment, but potential foundation for genuine healing, if Eric could eventually recognize it as such. By mid-July, with Eric's legal situation stabilized through the plea agreement and my own life finding new equilibrium, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. I would return to London for the twins' 16th birthday in August, leaving Phoenix during Eric's early probation period. The old guilt triggers surfaced immediately. What if he needed me? What if this abandoned him during critical recovery? What if my absence undermined his fragile progress? But beneath these familiar anxieties lay new understanding. Eric was a 42-year-old man whose recovery could not and should not depend on his mother's constant presence. My availability had never created lasting change before. Why would it now? When I informed him of my travel plans during a carefully structured coffee meeting, in public, with clear time limitations, as Diane had advised, his reaction proved surprisingly subdued. "London again?" he said, stirring his coffee with uncharacteristic restraint. "For how long?" 2 weeks, I replied. "The girl's birthday is August 12th. I'll return on the 20th. He nodded, eyes focused on his cup, rather than attempting the direct emotional appeal I had expected. "Will you see my probation officer before you go? She might have questions if I mention you're traveling." "I've already spoken with her," I confirmed. "She has contact information for both me and Diane if anything urgent arises." Another nod, still without meeting my gaze. Then, unexpectedly, "Bring the girls something from me? For their birthday?" The request, small, specific, focused on others rather than himself, represented such departure from his typical patterns that it momentarily caught me off guard. "Of course," I said. "Did you have something in mind?" "Not really." A slight shrug, then finally direct eye contact. "Maybe something that says Phoenix or Arizona, so they remember they have family here too. The sentiment behind this request, recognition of family connection beyond immediate self-interest, contained a hint of something I hadn't seen from Eric in years. Awareness of his place within a larger family system rather than as its central focus. Whether this represented momentary tactical adjustment or genuine shift remained uncertain. Experience had taught me to approach apparent changes in Eric's perspective with measured optimism rather than wholesale belief. But the request itself, modest, and consideration of others, warranted acknowledgement. "I think they'd like that," I said simply. My second journey to London carried none of the desperate escape quality of the first. This was not flight from crisis, but deliberate choice to nurture important relationships. A distinction that transformed everything from packing decisions to emotional preparation. Where my first trip had been reactive, this one was proactive. Where that one had been necessary sanctuary, this one was chosen connection. The girls greeted my arrival with the same enthusiasm, but less protective concern than my first visit. Their 16th birthday celebration, a combination of traditional family dinner and modern teen party with friends, provided joyful immersion in their expanding world. I presented them with carefully selected Arizona gifts, authentic Native American jewelry, chosen with their individual tastes in mind, accompanied by the small Phoenix figurines Eric had eventually selected after multiple text exchanges about options. "These are from your Uncle Eric," I explained, as they unwrapped the small glass birds, each one slightly different in color and posture. "He wanted you to have something that represented Phoenix, and also the idea of renewal." The girls exchanged glances with the silent communication of twins before Sophia asked carefully, "How is he doing? After everything?" The question contained mature recognition of complex family dynamics beyond their direct experience, awareness that their uncle's situation involved more than the simplified explanations they had received during my first visit. "He's working through a difficult process," I replied honestly. "The legal issues are being resolved through a plea agreement, and he's participating in counseling for his gambling addiction. The path forward isn't clear yet, but there are some small positive signs." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Addiction is really hard. We learned about it in health class, how it changes brain chemistry and decision-making. It's not just about willpower." "That's true," I acknowledged, touched by her attempt to find compassionate framework without excusing harmful behavior. But understanding addiction as an illness doesn't remove responsibility for seeking treatment and making amends. "Like in recovery programs," Sophia added. "Acknowledging harm done is part of the healing process, right?" Their thoughtful engagement with these complex concepts, free from both naive oversimplification and cynical dismissal, offered perspective I had often lacked in my own approach to Eric's behavior patterns. "That's exactly right," I confirmed. "Recovery involves both compassion for the struggle and accountability for actions." Later that evening, as the girls shared their gifts with friends who had stayed for a sleepover, James found me on the garden patio where I had stepped out for a moment of quiet reflection. "The Phoenix figurines were a nice touch," he observed, handing me a glass of wine as he joined me on the bench. "Eric's idea?" "Yes," I confirmed. He texted several options and asked for my opinion, but the final selection was his. James nodded, sipping his wine thoughtfully. "Small gesture, but not insignificant." "That's how I'm approaching it," I agreed. Cautious acknowledgement without overinterpretation. Wise. His simple validation of this measured perspective, neither dismissive skepticism nor wishful optimism, reflected how our relationship had evolved during these challenging months. "How are you feeling about everything now? 6 months into this new reality?" The question invited genuine reflection rather than performance of either resilience or distress. I considered it carefully, watching the last light fade from the London evening sky. "I'm finding my way," I said finally. "Some days I feel guilty for maintaining boundaries he perceives as punishment. Other days I worry I'm still enabling in more subtle ways. But mostly, I'm learning to live my own life again while still caring about his. That balance is the hardest part," James observed. "Caring deeply without being consumed by someone else's choices." "Exactly." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the distant sounds of teenage laughter drifting from the house, a reminder of life continuing to unfold in positive directions despite difficult circumstances. "Do you remember what Dad used to say?" James asked suddenly. "Love is support, not subsidy. The quote, one of Robert's characteristic pithy observations, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. How often had my late husband tried to gently guide me toward the very boundaries I had only established after hitting my own rock bottom through Eric's betrayal? I remember, I acknowledged. I just wasn't ready to understand what it meant. He knew that, James said gently. He also knew you'd find your way eventually. He always believed in your strength, even when you couldn't see it yourself. The validation, connecting my current journey to Robert's long-held faith and capabilities I had only recently recognized, offered healing continuity across years of loss and challenge. Perhaps I wasn't belatedly rejecting Robert's wisdom, but finally growing into alignment with it. When I returned to Phoenix in late August, the scorching summer showed no signs of relenting, but my internal landscape had continued its gradual transformation. The contrast between my London and Phoenix lives remained stark, but I now carried elements of both within me. The clear boundaries and self-respect cultivated abroad, combined with the resilience and determination forged in the desert heat. Eric and I established a new pattern of limited structured contact, coffee every other week, brief check-ins about practical matters, careful navigation of recovery process without either complete disengagement or enmeshed oversight. Whether this represented the beginning of healthier relationship or merely transitional arrangement remained uncertain, its future dependent on choices neither of us could fully predict. What had become clear, however, was that my own happiness and well-being no longer hinged on Eric's choices or outcomes. I could hope for his healing while living my own life fully. I could maintain appropriate maternal care without sacrificing my reclaimed independence. I could love him without enabling destruction, his or mine. The phone call I had made that afternoon after discovering his betrayal, the one he had always begged me never to make, had indeed changed everything, though not in the catastrophic way he had feared. It had broken patterns of secrecy and enabling that had served neither of us well. It had reconnected me with the son I had inadvertently neglected, while focusing on the one who demanded constant attention. It had opened pathways to relationships with granddaughters now emerging into young womanhood. Most importantly, it had initiated my own recovery from decades of unhealthy enabling disguised as maternal devotion. Like the Phoenix figurines Eric had selected for his nieces, I had emerged from painful ashes transformed, not unscathed, not unmarked by the experience, but renewed in essential ways that made the difficult journey worthwhile. As Arizona summer gradually yielded to the gentler embrace of autumn, I found myself looking forward rather than back, planning another London Christmas, considering part-time return to teaching, exploring community involvement that had been impossible during years of crisis management. The future contained both challenges and possibilities, uncertainties and opportunities. Whatever came next, I would face it with clear eyes and firm boundaries, guided by the wisdom hard experience had finally taught me, that love without limits isn't love at all, but it's pale and harmful imitation. True love, for others and oneself, requires the courage to establish boundaries that protect everyone involved from patterns of mutual destruction. The call I had made from my hospital room had been just the beginning of that journey, the first step toward the painful but necessary truth that had ultimately set us all free. The end.